So you may have heard of a grid or a layout grid before and really not been quite sure what that means.
Huh?
And the truth is it's quite simple. A grid is really just an underlying structure to a bunch of related pages. If you have a single page, you don't need a grid. You're just going to have a basic design and you're going to take care that the different elements relate to each other. But if you're doing multiple pages, such as a magazine design or a brochure or a catalog, then that underlying structure becomes very important because then from page to page, it gives it some cohesiveness. There's a connection to each page because they have common relationships. So a grid gives you the ability to organize a lot of complex content into a cohesive whole. A good grid definitely has that structure, but it also allows you some freedom, some flexibility. So I'm going to show you some different examples that this grid here can be used in different ways. Now, what you see on the page in front of you is what's called a 12-column grid. This 12-column grid has gained great acceptance. Lots of web pages are based on a 12-column grid, but the truth is that grids like this have been around for a very long time, well before the web came into play. But what's made this grid system so compelling is that it's got such wonderful flexibility, and this is more of a virtue of math than anything else. So if I look at this grid, I can look at it as a page having 4 different columns, which means they use 3 of those units. It can be 3 columns, which means they use 4 of those units. It can use 6 elements to create 2 columns on a page, or you can go in and combine all of these together. And that's really where the flexibility comes in. So it creates this really strong underlying structure, but because these have these fairly small units, it also gives you lots of flexibility. We'll even talk later about how then do you break out of this grid, which allows you to gain even greater interest. Okay, so say we have this grid and we have some elements to put into it. How do we use this grid to help organize those elements?
I don't know.
Well, I'm going to start off by adding some heads on the pages. I'm also going to go in and add some different images. And so you'll see that the 2 square cut pictures, in other words, the rectangular pictures, fit very precisely to that grid. And then the outlined image, the one where the background has been removed, also apply to the grid, but also break out of it at the same time. And then here I've added some captions and page numbers. And then finally, here are the primary copy blocks. So you can see they fit very neatly into that structure. And you can see the grid may be gone, but the structure remains. And so as you're moving forward and creating multiple page layouts, your project 3, I believe it is, and your final project will both involve multiple pages, specifically using InDesign. Well, you very much should consider creating a grid that will relate one page to the next.
Totally, for sure.
Moving forward, I'd like to show you some various layouts using this same grid, but I'd also like to talk about using different entry points in your layout. So when you're dealing with multiple pages, you want to make it very easy for the reader to have easy entry into each one of those layouts. And this relates very much to hierarchy. So where do you want them to look first? What order do you want them to look at the different elements in your layouts? And this can all be controlled by different decisions you make relative to your layout. The first layout I want to show you here is the same as what we looked at previously. But what I'd like to do now is talk about different ways the reader can enter this layout. So it's obvious there's 3 kind of compelling images, so that's a natural place for them to enter. 2 of the images have captions. There are certainly the headings on the page, and then there are subheadings. And so in this day and age, people don't like to read. So even if they subscribe to a magazine, say, most people aren't going to read most of what's in the magazine. They'll skim through and get the highlights, and then maybe an article or two they will be coerced into reading the body copy to really get the complete message. So your job as a visual communicator is to give them as many opportunities as possible to engage with your content. And so entry points can do this for you. This layout here has a couple of different types of entry points. And so very similar layout, but you'll notice that now the opening paragraph has a drop cap attached to it. So that's another point of interest that my eye immediately goes to. There's a pull quote down there in the rectangular pink box. So that allows me to actually read some of the content without having to get into the small type. And then, of course, the same entry points as previous in addition to that. And then this starts to deviate more. So this shows the grid, which the grid is still the same as it was before. It's just that I have allowed myself to break out of the grid in this case and to create a different kind of hierarchy and to create different type of entry points. And so you'll notice obviously the outlined pig without the background has become much bigger, so he's very much a focus now. The size of the pig illustration on the right has changed slightly, and then the picture on the left page has changed quite a bit. It's become more of an inset. I've also eliminated the captions on this version, so there's no longer that point of entry, but I've created an intro paragraph, which is basically the beginning of the story in large type. So the trick there is to get them to read the first paragraph or first part of a paragraph, and then they'll want to continue reading. We still have the head, we still have the subheads, so this layout has lots of entry points. And I would argue this is the more interesting of the layouts because the grid has been broken apart a little bit more. So there's still that structure, and it would still work with the underlined structure of other pages in the magazine, but it's created a more unique layout for the information that is being presented. So as you move forward with your layouts, the key is to engage the reader. It's very difficult to get people to read, even content which they have asked for. So you need to get them engaged, and that is your job as the visual communicator, is to pull them into the layout through these different entry points, and then hopefully they will engage with the content. Now, if you have an underlying grid structure that ties all of your different pages together, you have the ability to get great variety and also have continuity. In other words, all of the pages will look like they belong with all of the other pages. And so layout, particularly editorial layout like this, has a different set of challenges than other design areas, but it's really quite fun.